Sam had been a train driver for 12 years. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. He'd seen it all: bloody accidents, crazed passengers, even a few bodies on the tracks. But nothing ever really shook him. Not until that night. It started like any other shift. He was assigned to drive a train through the District 66, a rundown, nearly forgotten area where the tracks creaked like old bones and the stations were more rust than metal. The train itself was a relic, older than sin and just as cursed if you believed the stories. Most drivers avoided it like the plague, claiming it had a history. Sam, he didn't buy into that superstitious bullshit. Trains were machines. They didn't have ghosts. He clocked in, grabbed his worn leather gloves and made his way to the station. The night was colder than usual, a biting wind that carried whispers if you listened too hard. Sam didn't. He just wanted to get the job done, get home, and pour himself a stiff drink. The train stood there, looming in the darkness. Its once red paint had faded to a dull, lifeless maroon. The windows were smudged with something that looked like soot but wasn't. The air around it was thick, almost oppressive. But Sam didn't let it get to him. He was a professional, after all. As he boarded, the cold intensified. He could see his breath now, even though it was the middle of August. He flipped on the lights inside the train, but they flickered like they were resisting him, like they didn't want to show what was lurking in the corners. The control room was just as he expected, outdated but functional. He sat down in the creaky old chair, set his coffee beside him and began his pre-departure checks. Everything seemed normal. The gauges were where they should be, the brakes responsive, the engine purring along, but there was something off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way the train hummed, like it had a pulse of its own. Maybe it was the odd sensation of being watched, even though he was alone, or maybe it was the silence. The kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something waiting. The first few stops were uneventful. The usual late-night passengers, a couple of drunkards, a tired nurse, an old man with a face like he'd seen too much. They didn't say much, just slumped in their seats, waiting to get wherever they were going. Sam barely noticed them. He was too focused on that feeling, the one that was gnawing at him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And then came the sixth stop, District 66. Sam hadn't been there before, no reason to. It was one of those places people forgot about, a ghost town in the middle of nowhere, but there was a station there and he had to stop. The platform was empty, or so it seemed at first. But as he pulled the train to a halt, he saw a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the edge of the light. A man, maybe, or a shadow shaped like a man. It was hard to tell. The figure didn't move, didn't step closer, didn't signal to board, just stood there watching. Sam felt a chill run down his spine. He opened the doors, even though he didn't expect anyone to get on. And no one did. Not that he could see, anyway. But the train felt heavier, as if someone or something had entered. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. Just the empty carriage, the old seats with their frayed fabric, and that persistent, unnerving hum. He shut the doors, more to break the tension than anything else, and set the train in motion. But as they pulled away from the station, he heard it, a low, guttural whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew it wasn't his imagination. He whipped around, expecting to see someone right behind him. No one. But the whispering didn't stop. It got louder, more insistent, like 100 voices speaking at once, all of them angry, all of them desperate. The air grew thick with the scent of something foul, like rotting meat left out too long in the sun. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in his life, he felt real, bone-deep fear. He tried to shake it off, tell himself it was just the wind, the creaks of the old train, his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. He knew there was something else on that train, something he couldn't see but could feel, creeping closer with every passing second. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The hum of the train turned into a growl and the controls in front of him started to glitch. The needles on the gauges spinning wildly as if the train itself was panicking. Sam gripped the controls, trying to steady his hands, trying to keep the train on the tracks. But it felt like the train had a mind of its own, like it was fighting him, resisting him. And then he saw them. Reflections in the glass of the control room door, dozens of shadowy figures standing in the carriage behind him, their faces obscured, their forms flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. They didn't move, just stared at him with hollow eyes, eyes that were both there and not there, eyes that saw through him, into him, like they knew every sin, every secret he'd ever buried. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but he was frozen, trapped in that chair as the train hurtled forward. The whispering grew louder, filling his head, making it hard to think, to breathe. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping they'd be gone when he opened them, but when he did, they were closer, their distorted faces pressing against the glass, mouths moving in silent curses. And then the train began to slow down, not because Sam wanted it to, but because it had to. The engine sputtered, the brakes engaged on their own, and the train rolled to a stop. Sam looked up, heart hammering in his chest, and saw where they were. Another station, one that wasn't on any map he'd ever seen, a place that shouldn't exist. The platform was old, crumbling, overgrown with weeds and moss, and standing on it were more of them, shadows in human form, waiting. The doors opened, but Sam didn't touch the controls. They just opened, inviting whatever was out there to come in. The shadows boarded one by one, filling the train until there was no space left, until Sam could barely breathe under the weight of their presence. They didn't sit, didn't speak, just stared at him with those empty eyes. And then, without warning, the train started moving again. Faster this time, too fast, like it was trying to outrun something. But Sam knew deep down that there was no escape. He was trapped with them, with these things that weren't alive but weren't dead either. Things that had been waiting for him all along. He tried to stop the train, but the controls wouldn't respond. He tried to call for help, but the radio was dead, just static and more of that infernal whispering. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, with nothing but the shadows and the cold, suffocating darkness. The train raced through the night, faster and faster, the world outside a blur of black and grey. Sam could feel them closing in, could feel their cold breath on the back of his neck, their fingers brushing against his skin. He could hear their voices clearer now, and he finally understood what they were saying. They were calling his name. Sam looked up, and there in the rearview mirror he saw his own reflection. But it wasn't him. It was a twisted, distorted version of himself, eyes hollow and dead, skin pale and stretched tight over bone. The reflection smiled, a grotesque, mocking grin, and Sam realized with dawning horror that it wasn't a reflection at all. It was a glimpse of what he was becoming. The train plunged into a tunnel, the darkness swallowing everything. The whispering stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it pressed against his ears, his chest, his mind. And in that silence, Sam knew the truth. He was never leaving this train. He was a part of it now, just like the others. A ghost in a machine that wasn't supposed to exist, bound to the rails, forever moving, forever trapped. The train emerged from the tunnel into the dawn, but Sam didn't see it. He was gone, replaced by something else, something that looked like him but wasn't. The train slowed as it approached a station, Another forgotten stop in another forgotten place. The doors opened, and a new passenger boarded, unaware of the fate that awaited them. And as the train pulled away, leaving the station behind, a whisper echoed through the empty carriage, a whisper that carried on the wind, through the tracks, into the night. Welcome to the District 66, and the train kept going forever and ever, carrying the lost, the damned, and those who thought they could escape. But no one ever does. Not from the District 66, not from the shadows, not from what waits in the dark. Sarah was a force of nature, a whirlwind of curiosity and nerve. Most folks thought she was too brave or maybe just plain crazy. But Sarah, she didn't care much for whispers or warnings. She craved the unknown, the unexplained. See, Sarah was a final-year med student, a brain box they called her, but her curiosity, it went beyond textbooks and dissections. She had a soft spot for the strange, the eerie, the downright spooky. One late night, hunched over anatomy books with a classmate, Sarah stumbled upon it. A legend whispered in hushed tones, a place most folks avoided like the plague. "The Red Cemetery," her classmate muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's eyes lit up. This, she thought, this is what I've been waiting for. The Red Cemetery wasn't your typical graveyard. No, sir, this one had a reputation, a nasty one. Locals would tell you the soil ran red from the blood of souls trapped within its gates. Whispers and tales followed the cemetery like a shroud. Stories passed down through generations, tales of cold spots, disembodied voices, and shadows that moved with a life of their own. Some folks claimed the cemetery was built on cursed land, a place where ancient, unholy rituals had stained the earth. They said the spirits of those who died there, they never truly left. Friday night rolled around. While others hit the bars and clubs, Sarah, she had other plans. She grabbed her flashlight, pulled on her jacket. Tonight she was going on an adventure. The air grew colder as she neared the cemetery gates. A shiver ran down her spine. Don't be ridiculous, she thought. It's just an old graveyard. But there was no denying the feeling. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. With a groan, the rusty gates swung open. It was as if the cemetery itself was welcoming her, or maybe warning her. Sarah stepped inside. The ground crunched under her feet. That blood-red dirt, it was like nothing she'd ever seen. It felt wrong, unnatural. She shone her flashlight around. Rows of tombstones stretched out before her. A sea of stone, cold and silent. The air grew colder. A chill ran down her spine. She shook it off. Don't be silly, she told herself. It's just the wind. But deep down, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She walked deeper into the cemetery. The tombstones were old, many cracked and covered in moss. Names and dates, worn away by time, were barely visible. Each step felt heavier than the last. The silence pressed in on her. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt expectant, like something was waiting. She stopped at a particularly large tombstone. The inscription was completely gone, but as she reached out to touch it, she felt it, a faint vibration. It thrummed beneath her fingers, a low hum that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. Section 2, The Whispering Dead. Sarah pulled her hand back as if burned. She shone her light around, but there was nothing. Just the tombstones, silent and still. She listened. The silence was broken now by a low, mournful whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wind picked up, swirling around her. The whispers grew louder. Words, fragments of sentences carried on the breeze. She couldn't make them out, but the sound sent shivers down her spine. It was the sound of sorrow, of anger, of something ancient and deeply unsettling. She thought she saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. She swung her flashlight around, but it was gone. Just her imagination, she thought, trying to calm her racing heart. But the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. A twig snapped. She whirled around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the wind whistling through the trees and those whispers, those damned whispers growing louder, closer. She had to get out of there. Section 3. The Ancient Mausoleum. She turned to leave, but her flashlight beam fell on something else. Hidden amongst the trees, almost completely obscured by shadows, was a mausoleum. It was old, far older than any of the surrounding graves. The stone was cracked and weathered, and the iron gate hung precariously from its hinges. She should leave. She knew it, but something drew her towards the mausoleum, a morbid curiosity perhaps, or maybe something else, something she couldn't quite name. She took a deep breath and walked towards it. The gate creaked open with a groan that echoed through the cemetery, a sound that seemed to claw at the silence. She shone her flashlight inside. The air was thick and heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like macabre decorations. In the center of the mausoleum stood a single stone sarcophagus. It was ornately carved, depicting scenes of death and mourning. The lid of the sarcophagus was slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to open it or something. Section 1. A voice from the stone. The air inside the mausoleum felt different, heavier somehow, charged with a strange energy that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand on end. She took a hesitant step closer, drawn to the sarcophagus like a moth to a flame. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Then a whisper, so faint she almost missed it. It seemed to emanate from the sarcophagus itself, a low, mournful sigh. "Sarah." The voice sent a shiver down her spine. It was a woman's voice, weak and raspy, as if from beyond the grave. She knew she should run, get out of there while she still could, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She shone her flashlight on the sarcophagus, her hand trembling. The stone was cold to the touch, and she could feel that faint vibration again, that hum that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. Section 2. The Apparition. Sarah. The voice whispered again, closer now, stronger. The air around her grew colder, and a strange mist began to rise from the opening in the sarcophagus. The mist swirled and coalesced, taking on a vaguely human form. Sarah watched in horror as the figure solidified. It was a woman, or at least the ghostly remnants of one. Her skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow sockets burning with an eerie internal light. The woman reached out a hand, her touch icy cold as it brushed against Sarah's arm. Sarah gasped, a scream catching in her throat. The woman's touch sent a jolt of fear through her, a primal terror she had never known. "Leave this place," the ghost hissed, her voice a raspy whisper. "Leave now while you still can." Section 3. Fleeing the Dead. The ghost's touch snapped Sarah out of her trance. Adrenaline surged through her and she turned and ran, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. She could hear the ghost's voice behind her echoing through the mausoleum. "You should not have come here," the voice wailed. "You have disturbed the dead." Sarah didn't dare look back. She scrambled out of the mausoleum, her heart pounding in her chest. The rusty gate swung shut behind her with a clang, as if sealing her fate. She sprinted through the cemetery, her lungs burning, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the stillness. The whispers were back, louder than before, swirling around her, taunting her. She could feel the ghost's presence behind her, cold and menacing. She didn't slow down, not even when she reached the cemetery gates. She threw herself at them, her shoulder slamming against the rusted metal. The gates creaked open, and she stumbled out onto the road, falling to her knees in the dirt. Section 4. The Haunting Begins. Sarah didn't slow down until she reached the sanctuary of her apartment. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it, bolting it, as if that would keep out the horrors she had witnessed. She tried to tell herself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But deep down she knew the truth. She had seen something real in that mausoleum, something that defied explanation, something that chilled her to the core. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her. filled with images of the ghostly woman, her hollow eyes burning into Sarah's very soul. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin still lingering. During the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of her vision. Whispers followed her, faint and indistinct, but undeniably present. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. She couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her home from that cemetery. Days turned into weeks, but the haunting continued. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She started seeing things, fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open and slammed shut, and the temperature in her apartment plummeted without reason. She tried to confide in her friends, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the unexplainable? They would think she was crazy, and maybe she was. But that didn't make the fear any less real. One night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard it. The voice, clear as day, whispering her name from the darkness. Sarah. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She could feel a presence in the room with her, cold and menacing. Her eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows, but she could see nothing. Sarah, we are here. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They swirled around her, wrapping around her like icy fingers, dragging her down into the darkness. She was trapped. Her worst nightmare come true. The spirits of the Red Cemetery had followed her home. The light began to fade from Sarah's life. Sunlight, once so warm and inviting, now felt harsh and intrusive. She withdrew into herself, a prisoner in her own home. The whispers followed her everywhere. They taunted her, mocked her, reminded her of the darkness that clung to her. Sleep, once an escape, became a terrifying ordeal. The ghostly woman from the mausoleum haunted her dreams, her hollow eyes boring into Sarah's soul. Her studies, once her passion, now seemed trivial, meaningless. How could she focus on anatomy and physiology when her own world was unraveling? Her grades plummeted. Her friends, worried, tried to reach out, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance, lost in the fog that had descended upon her mind. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace. Every creak of the floorboard a whispered threat. The walls of her apartment, once a source of comfort and security, were closing in, suffocating her. Doubt gnawed at her sanity. Was she going mad? Was this all in her head? Her medical training told her that ghosts weren't real, that there had to be a logical explanation for what she was experiencing. She tried to convince herself that she was just stressed, overworked, that her mind was playing tricks on her. She tried to rationalize the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her skin, but deep down, a primal fear told her otherwise. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at her. Her skin was pale, her hair dull and lifeless. The spark of curiosity that had once burned so brightly in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull flicker of fear. She was losing herself, consumed by the darkness that had seeped into her life from that cursed cemetery. The thought terrified her, but it was a terrifying thought, mixed with a strange sense of inevitability. One night, the haunting took a sinister turn. She lay in bed, her body exhausted, her mind racing. Sleep wouldn't come, not tonight, not with the feeling of dread that hung so heavily in the air. The room grew cold, the temperature plummeting as if a window had been thrown open. But there was no breeze, no sound of wind or rain, just a deathly stillness that pressed down on her, suffocating her. Then she saw it. At the foot of her bed, a shadow coalesced from the darkness. It swirled and twisted, taking on the shape of the ghostly woman from the mausoleum. Her eyes, hollow black pits, burned into Sarah's soul. Terror, raw and primal, surged through her. She tried to scream, to move, but her body felt paralyzed, frozen in place by an unseen force. The ghostly woman glided closer, her movements fluid, effortless, as if she were a creature of smoke and shadow. "You are mine now," the ghost whispered, her voice a chilling rasp that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. "You belong to the Red Cemetery." The ghostly hand touched Sarah's forehead, and a jolt of icy fire surged through her body. She screamed, a sound that died in her throat, unheard, unheeded. Her vision blurred, the room spinning wildly. Then darkness swallowed her whole. When Sarah awoke, she found herself lying on the cold, damp ground. Disoriented, she sat up and looked around. Tombstones, ancient and weathered, surrounded her. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of mournful whispers carried on the wind. She was back in the Red Cemetery, trapped in a labyrinth of the dead. And this time she knew there would be no escape. The spirits had claimed her, body and soul. She was lost to the world, a prisoner of the Red Cemetery, forever bound to the restless dead. Sarah, the girl who once embraced life with open arms, was gone, vanished. The spark in her eyes, the one that had always burned so brightly, was extinguished, replaced by a dull, haunting emptiness. The world, once a place of wonder and excitement, had become a dim, shadowy reflection of its former self. She was a ghost in her own life, a spectre haunting the halls of her apartment, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her once bright smile, now a distant memory, rarely graced her lips. The joy that had once radiated from her, drawing people in with its warmth, had been replaced by an icy chill that pushed them away. The world outside continued to spin, oblivious to the torment that raged within her. The sun rose and set, oblivious to the darkness that had enveloped her soul. The laughter of children playing in the street was a distant echo, a painful reminder of a life she could no longer remember. She was adrift in a sea of shadows, the once familiar landmarks of her life swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Her dreams, once filled with aspirations and ambitions, had become nightmares, haunted by the ghostly woman and the oppressive presence of the Red Cemetery. Her textbooks lay open on the table, the pages filled with intricate diagrams of the human body, a subject that had once fascinated her. Now the words seemed to blur and swim before her eyes, their meaning lost in the fog that had descended upon her mind. She was a stranger in a familiar land, her own body a foreign entity. The scalpel, once an instrument of precision and knowledge, now felt cold and heavy in her hand, a symbol of the life she had once aspired to. Her reflection in the mirror was a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root within her. Her skin, once radiant with life, was now ashen and pale, stretched taut over her cheekbones. Her eyes, once sparkling with intelligence and curiosity, were now dull and lifeless, two dark pools reflecting the emptiness that consumed her soul. She was a shell of her former self, a hollowed-out vessel haunted by the spirits of the Red Cemetery. The girl who had once dared to explore the unknown had become a prisoner of her own fear, trapped in a labyrinth of her own making. The Red Cemetery held her captive, its grip on her soul tightening with each passing day. She could feel its presence everywhere, a suffocating weight on her chest, a constant reminder of the darkness that had claimed her. The whispers followed her, taunting her with fragments of memories distorted and laced with a chilling malice. They whispered of her failure, of her weakness, of her inevitable surrender to the darkness. She dreamed of the cemetery, its twisted trees and crumbling tombstones a constant backdrop to her nightmares. In her dreams, she wandered aimlessly through its overgrown paths, her footsteps echoing in the silence, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The cemetery had become her prison, its walls closing in on her, suffocating her with its oppressive presence. She was bound to it, tethered to its darkness by an invisible chain forged in fear and despair. The world outside faded to a distant hum, its vibrant colors and chaotic symphony replaced by the cold, silent embrace of the Red Cemetery, the warmth of the sun, the gentle caress of the breeze, the sounds of life and laughter. All were lost to her, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. She was no longer Sarah, the curious girl who had dared to tempt fate. She was nothing more than a vessel, a hollow shell inhabited by the restless spirits of the Red Cemetery. Their whispers filled her mind, their will her own. The ghostly woman from the mausoleum, her face a mask of both triumph and sorrow, stood over Sarah's lifeless form. Her work was done. The Red Cemetery had claimed another soul, adding another name to its ever-growing list of victims. The shadows stretched and danced, their forms shifting and swirling in the twilight. The Red Cemetery, its thirst for life momentarily sated, settled back into an uneasy silence, its secrets buried deep beneath the blood-red earth, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its path.
Mike dreaded the thought of the old house. His parents had left it to him, their final gift. The house stood on the outskirts of town, a forgotten relic. Its paint peeled like scabs, windows like vacant eyes. Mike's wife, Lilith, saw potential in the crumbling walls, space for their 2 young boys to play. The city had bled them dry with its exorbitant rent. Moving into the house was the practical choice, even if it chilled him to the bone. The house seemed smaller than he remembered, as if it had shrunk in on itself. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Mike felt a familiar unease creep up his spine. Lilith busied herself with unpacking, her cheerful disposition a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere. The boys, Lucas and Stephen, explored their new domain with cautious curiosity. As evening descended, the shadows in the house grew longer, twisting into grotesque shapes. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Exhaustion finally claimed them, the effort of the move outweighing even Mike's apprehension. Sleep came, but it was a restless, troubled sleep. The house invaded his dreams, transforming them into a chilling echo of his childhood fears. He dreamt of being a child again, trapped in the suffocating darkness of his room. He could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, coming closer with each passing second. Mike woke with a gasp, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent, but the silence held a sinister edge. The unsettling events of the first night cast a pall over the following days. Every creak of the floorboard, every sigh of the wind through the drafty windows sent shivers down Mike's spine. It began subtly, a whisper at the edge of hearing. Mike would be working in the study, his father's old room, when he'd hear it. A low murmur, like someone standing too close, speaking secrets meant only for him. The moment he turned his head to pinpoint the source, the sound would vanish. Lilith mentioned hearing her name called from the next room, a disembodied voice that sent chills down her spine. Each incident, dismissed as tricks of the old house, chipped away at their composure. The whispers grew bolder, more insistent, weaving their way into the fabric of their lives. The children too were not immune to the unsettling atmosphere of the house. Lucas, once a boisterous and energetic child, grew withdrawn, his laughter replaced by a haunting silence. He spent hours staring out of his bedroom window, his young eyes reflecting a fear that chilled Mike to the bone. Stephen, the younger of the two, began talking to an unseen presence. At first, Mike and Lilith dismissed it as an imaginary friend, a coping mechanism for the stress of the move. But Stephen's descriptions grew increasingly disturbing, his friend a shadowy figure that lurked in the corners of the house. One evening, Mike overheard Stephen whispering in the hallway. He cautiously approached his son, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you talking to, buddy?" he asked, forcing a calm he didn't feel. Stephen's response sent a shiver down his spine. "The man in the hallway," he replied, his voice devoid of fear. "He says he used to live here." The house seemed to react to their growing fear, its hold on them tightening with each passing day. Lilith discovered deep, angry scratches on the wall outside Stephen's room. They were fresh, the paint gouged deeply as if clawed by something possessed of immense strength. She scrubbed at the marks until her knuckles bled, but they refused to fade. Fear, raw and primal, took root in their hearts, whispering that they were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Sleep offered no respite, haunted by vivid nightmares of shadowy figures and disembodied voices. They were living in a state of perpetual terror, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Stephen's innocent descriptions of the man in the hallway sent chills down Mike's spine. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself it was just an imaginary friend, but the fear in his gut told a different story. The house was changing them, twisting their reality into something dark and sinister. One evening, while Lilith was reading to Stephen, Mike decided to investigate. He walked slowly down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He stopped outside the boys' room, listening intently. Silence. He was about to turn away when he heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from inside the room. He gently pushed the door open, his breath catching in his throat. Stephen was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the room. Lilith was asleep in the armchair beside his bed, her book lying open on her lap. "Stephen?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. Stephen didn't respond. He continued to stare at the corner of the room, his eyes fixated on something Mike couldn't see. The encounter with Stephen left Mike shaken to his core. He tried to convince himself that it was just a bad dream, but the look in Stephen's eyes, the cold, dead tone of his voice, haunted his waking hours. The house was closing in, its grip on their sanity tightening with each passing day. Mike's dreams were plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his vision, of whispers that pierced the veil of sleep, whispering his name, threatening him, driving him to the edge of madness. He began to see things, fleeting glimpses of movement in the shadows, a figure standing at the edge of his vision. Each time he turned to confront the apparition, it would vanish, leaving him questioning his sanity. Lilith, too, was deteriorating. One night, Mike woke to find Lilith standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the darkness. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. Her silence was more terrifying than any scream. "Lilith?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. She didn't respond. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently touched her shoulder. The scream that tore from Lilith's throat was inhuman, a guttural, primal sound that echoed through the house. Mike recoiled as if he had been struck. Lilith's eyes, wide with terror, were fixated on something behind him, something he couldn't see. It took hours to calm her down, to stop the tremors that racked her body. Even then, she refused to speak, to tell him what she had seen, but he didn't need words. He could see the terror reflected in her eyes, the knowledge that they were not alone in that house. They never had been. The decision to leave was like a physical weight lifting from Mike's chest, yet replaced with a leaden dread in the pit of his stomach. The house seemed to watch their every move as they packed, the whispers turning sharper, angrier. He caught Lilith staring at blank spaces on the wall where family photos once hung, her eyes distant and haunted. When she turned to him, her smile was brittle, fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. Lucas and Stephen moved like sleepwalkers through the chaos, their youthful energy replaced with a chilling stillness. Packing felt less like preparing for a move, and more like burying pieces of themselves within each box. Leaving the house was the hardest thing Mike had ever done. The air thrummed with an unseen energy, a tangible resistance that pressed against them like a physical force. As he steered the car down the driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Lilith in the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. Her gaze was fixed on the house in the rearview mirror, her expression unreadable. As the house disappeared from view, a wave of relief washed over Mike, only to be immediately replaced by a gnawing anxiety. They were leaving the house behind, but Mike knew, with a sinking certainty, that the house and its secrets would never truly leave them. The drive back to the city was a blur of exhaustion and unspoken fear. The silence in the car was broken only by the hum of the engine and the rustling of the wind. Mike kept his eyes on the road, afraid to look back, afraid of what he might see in the rearview mirror. Lilith sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her touch a lifeline in the oppressive silence. He knew she was thinking about Stephen, about the darkness that had taken root in their son's eyes. As they drove, Mike found himself replaying the events of the past few weeks in his mind, searching for an explanation, a reason. But there were no easy answers, no logical explanations for the things they had seen and heard. The familiar cityscape was a welcome sight, a beacon of normalcy after the nightmare of the house. As they crossed the city limits, a palpable tension seemed to lift from the car. Lilith took a deep breath, her grip on his arm loosening. "We're safe now," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Mike wanted to believe her, but a sliver of doubt lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped, merely outrun something sinister for a little while. They checked into a nondescript motel on the outskirts of the city, the anonymity of the place offering a strange comfort. The sterile silence of the motel room was both a relief and a source of unease. The absence of creaking floorboards and whispering walls was replaced by a different kind of quiet, one that seemed to amplify the whispers inside their minds. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with unsettling dreams. Mike would jolt awake in the dead of night, his heart pounding, the feeling of invisible eyes watching him linger long after he opened his eyes. He would lie there, listening to Lilith's shallow breaths, to the distant hum of traffic outside, seeking reassurance in the mundane sounds of the city. Lilith, too, seemed haunted by the experience. Her once bright eyes were clouded with a deep sadness, her smile strained. Stephen, on the other hand, remained withdrawn, his gaze distant and troubled. He carried with him an unnerving stillness, his silence punctuated by whispered conversations with his invisible companion. One evening, while Lilith was out getting takeout, Mike found Stephen sitting on the floor, carefully arranging a collection of small stones and twigs in a circle on the floor. He watched his son for a moment, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "What are you doing, buddy?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Stephen didn't look up. "He likes these," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He says they remind him of home." A shiver ran down Mike's spine. "Home?" he echoed, his voice catching in his throat. Stephen nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the circle of stones. "He says he's coming here," he whispered, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. "He says he's bringing a part of home with him." Mike stared at the circle, his blood turning to ice. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that they hadn't escaped the house at all. They had brought a part of it with them, a darkness that would follow them wherever they went. The house, it seemed, wasn't finished with them yet. It had sent a part of itself ahead, a harbinger of things to come. The city lights, once a comforting symbol of normalcy, now felt like a thin facade, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Mike found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, scanning the crowds for any sign of the entity that haunted his son. He tried to focus on the mundane tasks of finding a new apartment, enrolling Lucas in school, creating a sense of normalcy for his family. But the normalcy felt forced, a charade they were all playing, pretending they weren't carrying the weight of the house with them. Lilith, too, seemed to be struggling. She was withdrawn, her once infectious laughter replaced by a strained silence. She spent hours on the phone with her sister, her voice hushed, as if afraid to speak the words aloud, to give voice to the fear that consumed her. The stones and twigs, the unsettling gift from the house, remained untouched in the corner of Stephen's room. Mike wanted to throw them away, to cleanse their new home of any lingering presence, but he hesitated. He couldn't shake the feeling that to do so would be to invite something far worse. Nights were the worst. The silence of the city, broken only by the distant sirens and the hum of traffic, was a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of the house. Yet, it was in those quiet moments, when the city slept, that Mike felt most vulnerable, the memories of the house returning with a vengeance. He would lie awake, listening to Lilith's shallow breaths beside him, to Lucas's peaceful slumber in the next room, and he would be transported back to that hallway, the slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in his ears. He could almost feel the icy breath on the back of his neck, the unseen presence lurking just beyond the reach of his vision. Lilith, too, was plagued by nightmares. She would wake with a gasp, her body bathed in sweat, her eyes wide with terror. She wouldn't speak of what she had seen, but Mike could see the fear reflected in her eyes, the knowledge that the house had followed them, its tendrils reaching out from the darkness to reclaim them. They tried to maintain a facade of normalcy for the sake of the boys, but the effort was taking its toll. The laughter felt forced, the smiles strained. They were living in a perpetual state of unease, haunted by the knowledge that the house, and whatever resided within its walls, had not finished with them yet. The inherited house stood empty, a testament to the darkness that lay dormant within its walls. But the darkness was not confined to the physical structure. It had seeped into the lives of those who had dared to call it home, a malevolent entity that refused to be ignored. Mike and Lilith, despite their best efforts, found themselves forever changed by their experience. The city, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Every creak of the floorboard in their new apartment, every whisper of wind through the windows sent shivers down their spines, their senses on high alert, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The inheritance, it seemed, was not the house itself, but the darkness that resided within it. A darkness that had attached itself to them, an invisible tether that bound them to the house and its secrets. They had escaped the physical structure, but the true horror, the insidious, gnawing fear that had followed them home. They were left with a chilling certainty. The house might be gone, but their ordeal was far from over. The inheritance remained, a haunting reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.